Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. Now, I'm just going to get my gadget to fill in the gap here. Alexa, can you play a clip from Basic Instinct 2 that doesn't have a silly character name in it?
Who is he?
Richard Papovich, known to his friends as Dickie Pap.
Oh, bloody hell, Alexa.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's everything you need to know about me. The end of the podcast, though, well, it's given away by the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, star approval stories, all sorts of stories. The ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. Now, the films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I'm trying not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and an appreciation that somehow films manage to get made. Now, I should confess that for this particular episode, I'm not starting with a flat-out Oscar-winning classic. I think the best thing to do is if I just play you a clip from the film to set it up, and I'll come to the story the other side of this.
Her prints were all over the crime scene.
We haven't got a case, Roy.
Well, just make one. We'll order a psychiatrist to say she's a danger. Gotta make sure we get somebody good and tough.
Dr. Glass, this is Catherine Trudeau.
So is this where we're gonna do it?
So you're a writer. What do you write about?
Oh, the sexual, the violent, the basic instincts.
Sorry, you're not allowed to smoke in here.
You know what I like about you? You enjoy being in control. Like me.
But I'm not the one who's on trial for murder.
Not yet. Do I make you uncomfortable?
Careful, Michael. She's trying to seduce you.
Did you kill him?
If I said I didn't, would you believe me?
Everything that comes out of her mouth's a lie, even the truth's a lie.
What exactly do you want?
I wanted it from the first moment I saw you, and you did too. How do you picture it, Doctor?
Well, that's all very exciting, isn't it? That was a snippet from the trailer from 2006's Basic Instinct 2, Risk Addiction. Directed by Michael Caton Jones, working in the end from a screenplay by Leora Barish and Henry Bean, and starring Sharon Stone, David Morrissey, Charlotte Rampling and David Thewlis. And the origins of the project go right the way back to 1992, when the film Basic Instinct was a gigantic hit. It was a hit for Sharon Stone, it was a hit for Michael Douglas, for director Paul Verhoeven, and also for one of Hollywood's biggest ever independent production companies, Carolco, the firm that was working outside the studio system and spending hundreds of $millions on film after film after film. Now, the Carolco story goes far beyond this particular podcast, but just to say that their time was coming to an end in the years after Basic Instinct made an absolute mint at the box office. And in fact, in 1997, Carolco would ultimately go bankrupt off the back of films such as Cutthroat Island failing to perform, and it having to sell off a large chunk of its revenue stake in 1993's hit movie Cliffhanger. And so as it went bankrupt, so the rights to a whole bunch of its films went up for auction, and Basic Instinct was one of them. So after the 1992 original, there'd been some tepid conversations about a possible follow-up. Sharon Stone, did a pseudo follow-up of sorts, really, with 1993's Sliver, which I'll come to in a future episode of the podcast. But in 1997, a sequel hadn't been made, and in came MGM to snap up the rights to make a follow-up to Basic Instinct. Now, this was just as DVD was about to explode, but even so, the worst MGM figured it was going to get out of it was a straight-to-video release that would be cheap to make take and profitable. But that's not how things turned out. Because by 1999, it was talking up the idea of a Basic Instinct 2. And at this stage, none of the original stars were involved. There was a feeling that it was going to be a cash-in sequel, and it was looking to do it on the cheap. MGM was not flush with money, even though it had acquired these assets. And so spending mega bucks on a huge sequel wasn't really on the table. And then it soon was, because in 2000, 1 year later, let's step forward C2 Pictures. Now, C2 Pictures was a sort of sequel to Carolco. It had the original team behind it of Mario Casa and Andrew G. Wagner, and the pair had raised a whole bunch of extra funding, and they approached MGM, got into a conversation, and were going to put in a sizable amount of money for Basic Instinct 2 to now be a huge production. And so by June 2000 came the news. Sharon Stone was going to agree to return for the sequel, signing what turned out to be a very, very lucrative pay-or-play deal that was said to be worth $15 million. And pay-or-play, if you're not familiar with the term, means that Sharon Stone will get her money whether the film was made or not. As simple as that. You either pay up, you make the film. Either way, she was going to be very, very rich off the back of this. Now, an assortment of names were soon linked with the film. Die Hard director John McTiernan was soon in the running. In 1999, after all, he'd steered the Thomas Crown Affair remake to box office success and also acclaim too. And so for a tiny window of time, Pierce Brosnan was linked with appearing in Basic Instinct 2 and reuniting with John McTiernan for the film, but that very, very quickly fell through. Kurt Russell was said to have been offered $5 million, according to Newsday, to appear in the film. Again, not interested. Robert Downey Jr.'s name was in the mix. But at the heart of all of this was Sharon Stone, that she would have almost total approval over large elements of the project. Now, I should note that Sharon Stone wrote a memoir that was published a year or two ago at the point this has been recorded, and Basic Instinct 2 is not mentioned at all in that book. I have been through it, I've searched it, I could find no mention at all of this particular film. The original pops up lots of times, but I get the impression she's as unkeen on the film as others who we are going to discuss, but it does also mean that I'm going to be talking about a few things, and her voice isn't necessarily there to put the counter argument. I want to acknowledge that up front. However, the progress on the film was, for a little while it looked like it was going quite quickly, but in July 2000, Paul Verhoeven, the director of 1992's Basic Instinct, was promoting what would turn out to be, certainly at the time of recording, his last Hollywood movie, Hollow Man, starring Kevin Bacon. And in the midst of interviews and conversations about that film in July 2000, it was revealed that Paul Verhoeven had turned down the chance to direct Basic Instinct 2. According to a really reliable outlet called the Daily Mail, I don't know, he hurled the script across the room after reading a few segments, claiming it made him feel sick. And if it was in the Daily Mail, it was bound to be true. It did mean, whatever reason Verhoeven turned the film down, the only person who would be returning from the original ensemble was Sharon Stone. Screenwriter Joe Eszterhas, no interest at all in coming back. He hadn't had the best of times on a couple of projects since, detailed in his own memoir, which is one hell of a read, actually. Verhoeven, no. Michael Douglas, no interest whatsoever. And so there was kind of a feeling this is just going to be a cash-in kind of film. Get Sharon Stone in, get a bit like fruity in the film and send it out, count the cash. But in November 2000 came a real surprise, because a director you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be linked with the sequel was linked with the sequel. And for a while, David Cronenberg, of all people, was reported to be in final talks to direct Basic Instinct 2. Now, Stone had final approval over director and her leading man in the film, but for whatever reason, David Cronenberg's involvement didn't get past the final talks to direct the film. I don't know whether Stone wasn't keen. I don't know whether he wasn't keen. He was linked with a Total Recall sequel for a while, but he stepped away. He'd just done the film Extends at that point in his career. And in 2001, it wasn't just Cronenberg that was stepping away. The news came that MGM was dropping out of the film as well, that it was no longer interested. And so it looked like it was going to get quite shaky. Still, in January of 2001, things had been moving again quite forward just before MGM dropped out, because rehearsals, it was reported, were due to start in February of that year. As Variety was reporting, though, the problem was that no male star had signed up to appear opposite Sharon Stone, that people had either turned the film down or that Stone was not signing off on them. Her box office fortunes too were waning a little bit off the back of a couple of films that just hadn't really done anything. Gloria was one, The Muse was another. But in March 2001, it looked like there was going to be a breakthrough here when Benjamin Bratt met up with Sharon Stone to have conversations about starring alongside her in the film. MGM was still just about on board at this stage, but Stone hadn't approved the casting of Benjamin Bratt by the time of the required deadline that was set for the film, and later reports suggested that she wasn't impressed and she vetoed his casting. The bottom line, the clear 100% fact is Bratt did not appear in the film, and the film would now not appear for several more years as well. And legalities were starting to be thrown around too, because at the point the films collapsed, well, Sharon Stone had a pay or play deal in place, and she was entitled under the terms of that deal, it seems from me as a legal outsider, to her money, and she was getting litigious to try and get the money that she was owed. The film was still rumbling. In July 2003, though, it was taking a very, very different direction, even as legalities were building up. The lawsuit by this stage, it had been filed in the summer of 2001 at the point MGM was dropping out. 2 years later, it still hadn't been resolved. But there was a version of Basic Instinct 2 that was now no longer Basic Instinct 2. It was going to be a film called Risk Addiction that was in the style of Basic Instinct. Die Another Day director Lee Tamahori was linked with directing this time, and neither Sharon Stone nor Michael Douglas were said to be on board. At this stage too, Andrew Vajna and Mario Casas were out, C2 Pictures no longer involved. But at the point where it just looked like the whole thing was doomed, in came a knight in shining armour, and that was a German film fund called IMF3, which decided it had a few spare euros, why not pop a few quid into this absolute surefire, there's no way it could possibly miss, sequel to a huge Hollywood film. And it was the involvement, and it turned it into a real European co-production, actually. It was the involvement of IMF3 with C2 Pictures as well that helped pull together now a budget of $70 million. A large slice of which at least was going to Sharon Stone, but Sharon Stone was still in court or still threatening court. And for Mario Casas and Andrew G. Vajna, the conundrum they had is they could go to court with Sharon Stone, and their chances were, well, you take your chances in a courtroom. They could pay her bill, or would it just be cheaper to press ahead and make the film? And there's varying accounts of just what the catalyst was for getting Basic Instinct 2 finally greenlit, and one or two of those accounts suggest it was just cut your losses. It's just like, if we're going to have to pay out 8 figures anyway, you may as well make the bloody thing. And so in 2004, Sharon Stone settled her lawsuit. The terms were not disclosed, as Entertainment Weekly reported, but it was looking now that Basic Instinct 2 could finally go ahead, and it was Basic Instinct 2 again. That Leora Barish and Henry Bean were penning the screenplay for the film. Henry Bean's credits, he'd done some astonishingly good stuff. Internal Affairs and Deep Cover are both terrific films. I don't think Basic Instinct 2 is his best work. I don't think he would mind me saying that either. But a screenplay was clearly coming together. What wasn't happening was a male lead being put in place. Now, this didn't stop a lot of chitter-chatter, primarily against Sharon Stone, actually being reported in Hollywood trades about her demands for the film, that she wanted a private jet for 7 people, an armed bodyguard, protection around the clock. And it's not still actually that in the scheme of movie star demands seems that unreasonable, but there was clearly the knives out for Sharon Stone on the picture. It's worth noting too that she had options at this point. Her own schedule was not empty, that she was linked with a romantic comedy called Cougars that didn't happen, but looked for a while like it would. And she'd also been cast in a role in the film Alpha Dog as well that was due to shoot. But she remained the heart of Basic Instinct 2, and the quest was on to find a director that she was happy with, and also a male lead that she was happy with as well. Now, Michael Caton-Jones, Scottish director who's done films such as Scandal, the brilliant Rob Roy, The Jackal, more recently Our Ladies, which I've covered on a previous episode of this podcast. Now, he had been making a film in Rwanda for several months at this stage in his career, and a film that had really helped empty his bank balance. It's called Shooting Dogs. It was released in 2005, and he jumped from one film to another here. But he's freely admitted in several interviews, and I've interviewed him on this very podcast in a previous episode about a whole bunch of films, including this one, that he was skint. He was looking around for something to do. He needed a job, and Basic Instinct 2 came up. The script arrived. He took a look, and in September 2004 came the news that he was indeed set to direct the sequel. With Stone having settled out of court, we now have a director and we had a star, and we still didn't have the leading man for the film. What we did have, though, courtesy of court filings, was a list of more than 10 actors that Sharon Stone had approved for the role, were they to be available. And Los Angeles Times reported this, and the names were Robert Downey Jr., Rupert Everett, Javier Bardem, Gabriel Byrne, Benicio del Toro, Viggo Mortensen, Aaron Eckhart, Jude Law, Ewan McGregor, and Kurt Russell, none of whom would take on the co-lead in Basic Instinct 2. In fact, Rupert Everett would talk about his potential casting in the film back in more recently, actually, in an interview with the Irish Examiner, where he said he was ultimately turned down for the lead role in the film because of his sexuality, and that people couldn't see past that when putting the call sheet together for the film. But then David Morrissey came into focus, an actor who at this stage had been building up a whole bunch of acclaimed work on both stage and screen. And the Basic Instinct 2 project came to him while he was in the midst of making a film called Stoned. And so Stoned ultimately would come out in 2005. And this was the tale of one of the founding members of the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones, directed by Stephen Woolley and written by Bond regular screenwriters Neil Purvis and Robert Wade. And Morrissey picked the story up there that he was on the set. He was making that film in London, and he got a call from his agent about the Basic Instinct 2 script. And you know what? He read it and he liked it, and then he met up with Michael Caton-Jones, and the pair got on. And so, hang on, this might work. So you just need to pass the Sharon Stone approval test. And so a flight to Los Angeles was quickly organised, and Stone and Morrissey met for a few hours in LA, talked about the film, talked about the role, talked about how they were going to do it. And he passed muster with Stone and got the nod, and a formal offer came around the following day after his meeting in Los Angeles. And in the end, it was that quick. And so in January 2005, there was the confirmation. David Morrissey was going to take on the male lead role in Basic Instinct 2. We had a director, we had the lead female star. The cast was then fleshed out by the likes of Charlotte Rampling and David Thewlis, because also it was leaning towards British performers, because the film was going to shoot almost exclusively in the UK. And in fact, it was on the 18th of April 2005 in London that the first shot was called, and a film that looked like at one stage it was going to collapse under the weight of legalities was finally pressing forward. Now, Michael Caton-Jones had gone into making Basic Instinct 2 and knowing to a degree what he was getting into. He knew this was going to be a bit of a slog, and he explained in an interview with The Scotsman, he just said the experience of making it was horrible. And he said, I knew before I started that it wasn't going to be a particularly good film, which is a very, very painful thing. But he'd just been making Shooting Dogs, and he'd had 6 months with no income. The job of Basic Instinct 2 had come along when he had no money, and he took it and he regretted it. And as he told The Scotsman, I had a young child and rent to pay, and I went off to Rwanda for 6 months. I was completely broke and had to take anything that came in. Basic Instinct 2 was this poison chalice that had been passed around, and eventually it arrived at my door. Basic Instinct films, both of them, involved a fair amount of what you could call mildly fruity scenes. Scenes too where clothes are either optional or required to be made of wool, referring to the original film. And David Morrissey talked about this because he'd never really made a full-on erotic thriller before, about whether he was uncomfortable with this. And he told Female in Australia, just like, well, you approach these scenes like any other scene. And he said, I know that's slightly a cliche for actors, but it's true really, in the sense that to tell a story as an actor, you're wondering what your character is trying to go through in the scene, which is quite an unfortunate phrase in the context. Why are the characters here? What's at stake and stuff? But he also admitted you're a little nervous as well because you're butt naked in front of a lot of the crew, really. The production was not a happy one. And when Michael Caton-Jones appeared on this podcast previously, he just talked about how he and Sharon Stone did not see eye to eye. In particular, about 3/4 of the way through shooting, they had a big bust up. And by the time they got to the end of the movie, it was clear that they were not going to be exchanging Christmas cards. And in fact, as he said in an interview, when the film wrapped up in August 2005, he said, the day we finished shooting was the last day I spoke to her. By then we hated each other. He also said, Basic Instinct 2 turned me off filmmaking for a long time. But on the upside, David Morrissey got a house out of it, which sounds a little bit like the Michael Caine Jaws the Revenge story, where Michael Caine was asked about Jaws the Revenge, just like, never seen the film, but I have seen the house that it paid for. I did ask Michael Caton-Jones if there were any upsides of it, and he just said, well, yeah, I met my Hungarian editor on Basic Instinct 2, and the Hungarian editor would be István Károlyi. They had to change editors on midway through the production of this. But also Caton-Jones said, I liked the actors, I liked the look of the film, I detested Sharon Stone. And from what I can work out, I don't think Sharon Stone was a massive fan of Michael Caton-Jones either. However, they got to the end of the shoot and it had wrapped up by August of 2005 with a view towards a release in the spring of 2006. But the post-production on the film was tricky because, well, there was a lot of nookie that was shot, and in the original cuts that were put through, there was a lot of nookie in those as well. Now, predictably, in America, the Motion Picture Association of America, an organisation that seems to allow you to watch as much bloodthirsty violence as you like, but take your trousers off and we're going to have a chat. Well, it was in the midst of deciding that sex was a bad thing and it wanted less of it, really. And so Basic Instinct 2 was put before the American Ratings Board and was slapped almost inevitably with an NC-17 rating. Now, for those outside of the US who are unfamiliar with this, NC-17, particularly in the mid-2000s, meant that nobody under the age of 17 could see the film. Now, studios mandated an R rating, which only gives the guidance that the film might not be suitable for under 17s. However, if you want to organise a kids' party to come and watch a Basic Instinct movie, as long as you bring an adult along under the American rating system, you're allowed. Now, the NC-17 rating is a problem because most American movie chains refuse to play films that have got NC-17 ratings. Certainly in the video era as well, most of the major video chains, well, they wouldn't stock tapes that had NC-17 ratings. So it was very clear that this was going to have to be cut back to get the necessary R to get the film the wide release that its budget of $70 million, for that is what it cost, to get any chance of getting some of that money back. I should note at this point, in one of the most bizarre pieces of casting in all the time I've been doing this podcast, there is some of that $70 million went to a former footballer, a man called Stan Collymore. Now, Stan Collymore is a man who's attracted controversy, which you can find online, but he's never struck even his most ardent of fans, I'd suggest, as a movie star. However, in one of the most offbeat pieces of casting, he gets a cameo-ish role early in the film. I'm not going to go heavy spoilery, but short of to say he's not in it so much towards the end of the film. But yeah, there's Collymore in a film with Sharon Stone, which only happened once. I can assure you it has not happened since. Also, while all the cuts and toing and froing were going on, well, the subtitle Risk Addiction was also dropped in some territories, or picked up in others. And while the film was being edited, Sony picked up the catalogue for MGM and ended up with the release of the film in the US. It didn't have distribution elsewhere around the world, so Entertainment Film Distributors picked it up in the UK. Sony released it in the US. Constantine Film was in Germany, different distributor in Spain as well. And so there were a package of individual distributors that were helping to fund that $70 million. And in the end, a cut was agreed that was appropriate to be released in the US. As part of the press tour as well, building up to that US release, Sharon Stone admitted that she was interested in a Basic Instinct 3 and that she would be tempted to direct a possible Basic Instinct 3. The only thing that needed to happen was the film went down well, that or made a lot of money, and neither of those things happened. The reviews when Basic Instinct 2 went before critics were some of the most hostile I've encountered in all of the episodes I have done of this podcast. That there were one or two people who kind of punched for it a little bit, but the vast majority of critics had their pitchforks out and absolutely went for the film. They tore it apart, absolutely tore it apart. They hated it. The reviews were hostile, were unpleasant, and, well, heading into the opening weekend, its chances were of returning some of the money that had been spent on it. Let's just say they were depleting fast. Still, Sony gave it a good go, and it released the movie at the end of March 2006 in America on over 1,000 screens. I mean, it didn't go massively wide, but it did enough that it should have made some degree of impact. Basic Instinct 2, though, opened in 10th place. A 9th place, to give it some degree of context, was The Shaggy Dog from Walt Disney Studios on its 4th week of release. Basic Instinct 2's first week of release, $3.2 million. When you consider the original film crossed 300 million worldwide, well, that was not going to happen. Now, there was competition, but I mean, the big opener that weekend was Ice Age The Meltdown, which opened with 68 million. But I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that the audience who would go and watch Basic Instinct 2 is not necessarily the same as that would go and watch Ice Age The Meltdown, no matter what the American rating system tries to make palatable. Other films that were around, Spike Lee's Inside Man was in 2nd place. ATL opened in 3rd. Failure to Launch was 4th. V for Vendetta was on its 3rd week. Stay Alive, another Disney picture, that was sitting there in 6th. She's the Man, Slither's a great, what a slice of fun that is. Basic Instinct 2, though, it barely crept into the top 10, and in fact it only just managed to do that by about $50,000, holding off the charge of Larry the Cable Guy: Health Inspector on its 2nd weekend. It didn't land in the top 10 in week 2. It had dropped 70% of its business, just took $1 million in its 2nd weekend, and within weeks it was just gone. Its time in cinemas had been brief, and the film, by the time it exited the US theatrical circuit, had taken just 5.9 million in America. Now, outside of America, it fared just slightly better, 32 million in territories right around the world, but the overall gross of $38 million, there was no way of just painting this as anything other than a monumental flop, and one that, well, when certain horrible awards came round for that aren't particular praising of films, well, it was heavily in the running and taking home lots of prizes for not being a good film. Let me just put it delicately like that. In the aftermath of Basic Instinct 2, well, the plans for Basic Instinct 3 went through the shredder in a matter of minutes, I would imagine. Michael Caton Jones would vow not to make a film ever for the money again. He said he would do television, but he'd need to do something he really cared about to commit to a feature film. And it wouldn't be for several years before he took on the feature Urban Hymn, starring Shirley Henderson. One person who didn't regret it, though, was David Morrissey. And he was asked about this in a Guardian Q&A, and he just said, I made great friends on it. I thought it was a great script. And he admitted, I know it didn't turn out to be the greatest film in the world, but I've never regretted any job I've gone into. You learn from all your work, but the knocks that you take, whether it be from journalists, reviews, etc., all serve to make you stronger. I'd give the last word to Sharon Stone, but I will acknowledge that, again, that she decided not to mention this film in her book and hasn't really talked about it since. She was the one, I would suggest, in the end, who did the best out of it, even though the media was pouring over her, really. Her bank balance, at the very least, was boosted by some $15 million. And just looking at the current asking price of Basic Instinct 2 on DVD, the uncut version, of course, the fee that she got for the film would now allow her to buy 7.5 million copies of it on DVD. Imagine that. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. I'm just going to do a couple of parish notices in the middle of this. So if you like this podcast, first of all, my trio of requests, if you can do any or all of these, that would be amazing. If you like it and don't mind financially supporting what we're trying to do with Film Stories, if you go to patreon.com/Simon Brew, that's where if you put a couple of pounds in the pot there, you get the podcast early, pretty much every week. You get it ad-free as well. You find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes as well. There's an awful lot of Film Stories projects just bubbling at the moment. Costing you no money whatsoever is just subscribing at your podcast home of choice and leaving ideally a hugely positive review as well. These are the kind of things that really help independent podcasts like this one. I'm also taking Film Stories back on the road. I'm doing more live shows, 90 minutes of me nerding on about movies. I'm going to Birmingham in the UK on March the 29th, 2023 at the Midlands Arts Centre. I am in London on April the 20th, and I am in Stockport on May the 3rd. All ticket details there are on the Film Stories website. If you just click on the live events tab at www.filmstories.co.uk, you can find out all about those shows. We're also just about to release into the world issue 41 of our print film magazine, Film Stories. Cunning title, where do we get it from? That's leading with the story behind the brand new Tetris movie, and that's going up for order at store.filmstories.co.uk. However, that's enough plugs. I'm going to move on to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. This one didn't set the box office alight either in quite the way that was expected, but it's quite a story again. Let's take you all the way back to the mid to late 1990s. I'll play you a clip from the trailer. I'll come to the story, the other side of this.
In the middle of rush hour, 100 feet below the Hudson River, the unthinkable is about to happen.
Simulation, they'll all be dead before you get through dead.
How many people are left alive down there?
Maybe a dozen, and we're in the middle of the tunnel.
That tunnel is sealed from both ends.
We're gonna die. I'm gonna try to find you some help.
So that's a clip from the trailer from 1996's Daylight, directed by Rob Cohen, written by Leslie Bohem, and starring Sylvester Stallone, Amy Brenneman, Viggo Mortensen, Dan Hedaya, J.O. Sanders, Karen Young, Claire Bloom, Barry Newman, and Stan Shaw. And this is a disaster movie that was inspired by a real-life explosion in New York in the 1940s in the Holland Tunnel, and it was that really that inspired the creation of the film, that fairly quickly had Leslie Bohem penning the script for it, that had Rob Cohen attached as director. But for the purposes of this story, I'm going to centre a little bit more on Sylvester Stallone and the production of the film. I mean, Rob Cohen, I should note, came to this off the back of making Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, released in 1993. He'd spent a couple of years making Dragonheart, also for Universal, that was released in 1996. I want to acknowledge up front as well that there are very serious allegations currently out there against Rob Cohen that he has denied, but as always, I just want to acknowledge things like that, and you can go elsewhere and read all about them. But for the purposes of this particular story, I'm going to move on to 1995, which, as it turned out, was the year before Daylight was released, because this was a turning point in the career of its star, Sylvester Stallone, that he'd had a career resurrection really in 1993 with the double bill of Cliffhanger and Demolition Man, both of which had seen him reverse his box office fortunes. He'd been struggling with comedies in the early 1990s, such as Oscar and Stop or My Mom Will Shoot. He only managed to get films over $100 million at the box office if they had the words Rambo or Rocky in them in more recent times. But Cliffhanger and Demolition Man, both, even though they didn't necessarily go nuclear in the US, they proved successes around the globe. Demolition Man in particular is a real favourite of mine. And he came back into vogue just at a point where movie star salaries were ballooning. So in 1991, for instance, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, Arnold Schwarzenegger notably got $15 million, part of which was paid for in a plane and not the Gerard Butler type. Jim Carrey was just about to take home $20 million for the film The Cable Guy, the film that broke the $20 million ceiling for movie stars in the US. And Universal had this project, Daylight. It had a director attached, Rob Cohen. And Cohen originally was looking for this disaster movie to star Nicolas Cage. Now, this was before the Nicolas Cage trinity of joy, The Rock, Con Air and Face Off. And so he hadn't quite proven his chops as an action star at this point, though, or certainly not at the box office. And so Universal was a little bit reluctant to go with Cage, but instead was more interested in writing an enormous check and sending it in the direction of Sylvester Stallone, because Stallone, it figured, had international appeal. He was just about to release his latest big blockbuster, a film called Judge Dredd. Remember that? He got $15 million off Warner Brothers to make the film Assassins, which I'll come to shortly. And he was heavily in demand, to the point where Universal decided, he's the person we want, and it stumped up $17.5 million, his record payday to that point, to take the lead in the film Daylight. Now, Stallone also in and around this time was about to get a $20 million payday as well for a film called High Roller. Now, High Roller, from the writer of Under Siege, is a film you may recall never actually seeing because it doesn't exist. It was one of the projects put together in a slate by a company called Savoy Pictures. Now, Savoy had enjoyed some fairly modest successes. John Waters' Serial Mum, for instance, terrific film. That I will come to that at some point. But Serial Mum was a Savoy film. It was looking to ramp up what it was doing. It was in the running to make a film of the Tom Clancy book Without Remorse, and that's only happened in more recent years. And it wanted Sylvester Stallone to headline this action film, High Rollers, that he was going to pay him $20 million, a move that just jolted Hollywood because, again, Stallone wasn't bringing in $100 million at the US box office, and he was going to get a $20 million upfront fee. Well, Savoy would be filing for bankruptcy within a year or two, and that picture would never happen. But still, $17.5 million straight into Stallone's bank account for Daylight. And as Variety reported in April 1995, news that Stallone would land his highest payday from Universal last week for the starring role in Daylight reverberated quickly. Stallone, now working for $15 million on Warner Brothers' Assassins, will get $20 million from Savoy, and just days ago he turned down a $17.5 million offer from Warner Brothers for a 1996 slot. I've got no idea what that 1996 Warner Brothers film was, but he was heavily in demand and he was getting the paychecks of his life. But also he was coming to a bit of a career crossroads in his head because he was just turning 50 and he wasn't really that sure he wanted to do another big studio action film. That Cliffhanger had been a very difficult film to make. It had a lot of stunts, lots of aches and pains for Stallone as well. And as he explained with Daylight in an interview that's been archived by Film Threat, as a couple of the interviews in this particular story have been, he said, when I was offered this movie, I thought 6 months of filming in Rome, that would be wonderful. However, as he would realise, every day we arrived at the tunnel at the crack of dawn and we left at night. It didn't matter where we were shooting. He was going to be spending a lot of time in a tunnel. If you are not familiar with Daylight, it is the story of a tunnel collapse, almost in the spirit of something like the Poseidon Adventure, and Stallone is the everyday hero, not the big brawny action hero, the everyday hero who tries to lure people to safety. And so he liked the idea of that. And in fact, his next two films would see him taking a different direction. So this was going to be one of them. The next after that would be Copland, which I'll briefly mention shortly. But as he was gearing up to film Daylight, well, Universal decided actually it didn't just want one Sylvester Stallone movie, it wanted three of them. And so in the summer of 95, it inked a deal with Sly to star in three further films after Daylight at $20 million apiece. Remarkably too, this deal was a non-exclusive one. Stallone could shop his projects elsewhere if he wanted to, but the plan was you make your three films with Universal, you'll be banking $60 million. As it turned out, he would only make one of those films. It would be called Detox. The chances are you've not heard of it, and that probably tells you a lot about what you need to know about it. It changed its title for the UK release as well. It would be fair to say that Stallone's agent made the deal at just the right time, because as we're going to discover in Daylight, this is one of the films that came at a turning point in Hollywood blockbuster cinema. And in fact, things were already turning in 1995, because even as Universal was considering emptying its piggy bank and giving it to Stallone, well, the box office for Judge Dredd wasn't exactly setting the world alight. The reviews weren't great either, which didn't help. But Judge Dredd did business outside of the US, and that's what Hollywood had its eyes on, really. However, then Assassins came out, and Assassins was penned by the Wachowskis. It would pave the way, really, their experience on that, to Bound and to The Matrix. Directed by Richard Donner, starred opposite Antonio Banderas, but it just didn't do the business. Lots of stories about what a joy it was, that set, as lots of Richard Donner's sets are, but when it landed in cinemas, it's just a little bit of a thud, really. Also, The Specialist had happened by this point as well, opposite Sharon Stone. That hadn't gone great guns, but again, had travelled overseas. However, the numbers that were being bandied in the direction of Stallone were still just not really meshing up to what he was delivering at the box office. However, he threw himself into Daylight, and he would talk in interviews about this was kind of the film he was looking for, a movie where instead of having like your standard movie villain, the adversary here was nature. And he said he was actively looking for the kind of scripts that he never got offered, the scripts that Al Pacino gets, that Harrison Ford gets, that in particular after the Rambo and Rocky films had gone nuts, he was getting more and more films that had less and less dialogue in. They just wanted him for the action. And he was trying to get back to kind of the spirit of the original Rocky film. And he talked about the screenplay from Leslie Boehm. He said, in the original script, my character was a wise guy. He would be working on people, but there was so much blood and catastrophe that after a while, he began to take it all lightly. He said he'd be sitting there with blood on his hands and be eating a piece of pizza. And it was like, blood, tomato sauce, what's the difference? And Stallone didn't want that. And what he wanted to do was, in his words, scale down the audience's expectations of him and the character. And he said, everything that was expected, I tried to just not do. Most importantly, and he said, I don't know if it comes across in the film, my character isn't really worried about saving anyone through the first half of the film. He's doing everything for his own selfish reasons to relieve his guilt. So it's only in the end he tries to come through. And he talked too about an alternate ending of the movie with a different fate for his character as well, that he knew the studio wouldn't let through, but that was the direction he was looking to push. He also argued that would be the logical ending of the film, but it was also the one that we didn't get. Now, with Stallone on board, with the director on board, with Universal spending mega bucks on this, and the ultimate film's budget would be $80 million, a quarter of which was going to Sylvester Stallone, Rob Cohen had to cast the rest of the movie. And he talked too about when he got to the finalists of the cast after Sly was cast in the role. He said we get an actor or a group of actors that were in the semi-finals. I'd sit them down and say, let me show you the model of the tunnel. It's 1/3 of a mile long. It's going to be filled with water. You're going to be in the water. You're going to be in the water day after day, week after week. And then he said, this is the side of the chapel. It's not much bigger than a living room. You're going to be in there with 2,000 rats. And he asked the candidates for the roles, do you want to do it? And he noted that certainly a couple of older performers decided that really wasn't for them. Cohen was upfront about he wasn't going to bring in doubles. If you wanted to be in the film, you had to be in the water there as well. If you want the part, these are the conditions. And so you go through to the final if you want to, but if not, you drop out. And so several dropped out, but several stayed in. And then for the female lead, he eventually centred on Amy Brenneman. Now, she was someone that Rob Cohen had seen on the television show NYPD Blue, but at the time she was shooting the film Heat for Michael Mann, which we covered just a few episodes ago on this podcast. And so he was friendly with Michael Mann, gave him a call and just said, can I look at some of the footage of her acting opposite Robert De Niro in that film? Because he was concerned that Stallone wouldn't really see her as a female lead in a big blockbuster movie. There were a couple of very 90s comments in the interviews going backwards and forwards on this. But Michael Mann agreed to send some scenes over. And off the back of that, Stallone was convinced, Universal was convinced, Cohen was convinced, and the film was ready to go. 25th of September 1995, production could begin with Brenneman starring opposite Sylvester Stallone. Now, for a film set in the New York tunnel system, the movie, oddly enough, ended up in Rome. Or perhaps less oddly, because Cinecittà Studios in Rome was where they had the flexibility to build the tunnel set of the movie that would run to a third of a mile long, as Cohen had previously explained. Now, this was an era for very long movie sets. If you remember the Wesley Snipes, Woody Harrelson film Money Train, that at one stage had, I believe, the longest movie set in the world for that. And this wasn't on the short side either. But why they ended up in Rome was also to do with flooding, because they needed sound stages that they could build the tunnel set on, that they could flood, and that could give them the flexibility they needed as well. And Cohen was looking to do this in camera with some miniature work as well. So joyfully, there's some miniature effects work that you see in the midst of the film, particularly explosion sequences, let's say that. And Cohen admitted coming to the set with a little bit of trepidation about working with Stallone. Stallone had occasional sparks that he wasn't the easiest person to work with. But by the time the pair of them were on set together, well, they'd spent a long time just talking about the character, about the costumes, about co-stars. And he said all of those initial conversations are tests of who's going to prevail, whose vision is what's the relationship going to be, how's it going to function. And Cohen explained that really what happened during the conversations in preparation was Stallone feeling him out, Cohen feeling him out, Stallone out, and just working out what the expectations were. And in Cohen's words, letting him know quite clearly that I'm not some young rock video director and I'm not going to be a surrogate director for him. Stallone, by this stage, had several films to his name as director, and so if he wanted to helm it himself, he could have done, but Cohen was insistent this was going to be his film. And so they got to the set and they got along. And as Cohen explained, in a film like Daylight, where there can be as much as 8 hours between two shots because the shots are so complex to set up, he said you get one shot at that sometimes. It meant there were a lot of time spent with the actors and the crew just waiting to sit around and really laugh and relieve the tension of all the fires and the water and the discomfort. And they described it as a pleasure, something really quite surprising. Talking too about how friendly and funny Stallone was on the set of Daylight. And he too was giving, an interview came out while it was shooting about he was just having second thoughts altogether about making action movies. Certainly the kind of traditional action movies that he'd been making in his career a lot to that point. And he gave an interview suggesting he'd be leaving them behind. But he did add to Film Review magazine, and its February 1997 issue, when it came time to promote Daylight, he said, I tend to be overly dramatic at times. But the Rambo Last Blood star insisted I won't be doing any new action movies where there's no room for acting. And in fact, he was already eyeing up the film that he was going to do next, a genuine left turn in his career, James Mangold's film Copland, that would see him working opposite Robert De Niro. And I don't know if any of you out there were as much fans of Barry Norman's film programme as I, but Film 96 had an on-set location report with from the set of Daylight, where interviewer Tom Brooke was sent out to interview Stallone. And he was, even during the promotion of Daylight, he was criticising the films that he'd done just a year before. He criticised Judge Dredd in that interview and just said he knew it wasn't going to work. And he was talking about how he wanted a more down-to-earth action hero. He thought the era of superhero action heroes was pretty much gone. Cohen, meanwhile, told Film 96 that he saw Stallone's character as more a community leader than a macho brute, a hero for the 90s, no guns, no terrorists, a consensus builder and not a messiah. And they argued that this was going to be a template for new kinds of movie heroes in the future. And so with some degree of confidence, filming wrapped up on the 28th of February 1996. It had spent 3 months in Rome in the end. It'd done some shooting in the US as well. And Cohen had a bit of time to get his final cut together, that Universal wasn't looking to put this in cinemas until the end of 1996. But 1996 was, again, a transformative year for cinema, because this was when the big effects films really started to take hold. That we'd had Jurassic Park in 1993, but 96 was Independence Day, that one of the biggest box office hits of the year was a film really without a movie star in it. Now, of course, it has Will Smith starring in Independence Day, but Will Smith was not Will Smith, the world's biggest movie star at that point. He was not without profile, but Independence Day was, of course, a film that sold off a trailer where a massive spaceship destroys a model of the White House. And now, several months later, Universal was trying to sell a film with an old-style Hollywood action star who'd been paid an enormous amount of money for the privilege, but it suddenly looked quite a traditional kind of blockbuster film and not a cheap one. And so perhaps that's why the marketing of it really started a little bit earlier than you might expect, that it started running TV spots for Daylight in September of 1996, even though the film was not going to open for, 3 months. And there was a general feeling in Hollywood that this was a bit of a risk, that Stallone was stepping away from the Rockies and from the Rambos, that his recent box office hadn't set the world alight. And he was, I mean, the fact that he was criticising some of his previous films, I mean, it made good headlines, but would audiences then come out and watch this one? And especially when Stallone was talking up so much his new direction. I mean, he said again, Film Threat picked up this interview. He said, the last time I'd done a film without this kind of gimmickry, Stallone insisted, was First Blood in 1982. After that, my career began to move away from what I think I do best into something. And he said, well, it was completely out of my hands and science took over. He didn't explain what the something was. Now I'm just trying to say, enough of science. So down with science, said Sylvester Stallone. Daylight went before critics towards the end of 1996. And, well, again, it's not a story with a particularly happy ending, this, that if they were looking to capture the spirit of the Poseidon Adventure and films of that ilk, it hadn't really worked. That whilst, again, there were some positive reviews in there, it just didn't build up quite the level of tension that it was felt a disaster movie of this ilk would need. That the whole setup was good, and in fact the setup of a tunnel collapsing and all the bits and bobs that contributed to that was good, but the film in the middle, well, did it really work? It was all right, was generally the consensus. There are some people who really came out against it, but this is a podcast where I've just talked about Basic Instinct 2, so to be fair, this looks a bit like I don't know, this looks like a bit like The Godfather compared to that in terms of the response, but it wasn't really enough to bolster Universal's confidence. And to look at the films that were about when it opened the weekend of December the 6th to the 8th, 1996, well, it was the winter of Ransom, the Mel Gibson headlined Ransom. A slightly offbeat blockbuster film, that, and that had more of an anti-hero to it, and that had worked. The Independence Day was still about, but the number one movie was Disney's live-action remake of 101 Dalmatians on its second weekend, where it picked up $13 million. Daylight just scraped past $10 million, and that was a big disappointment. I mean, it knocked some of the other contenders down the chart. Star Trek First Contact was in third place. An Arnold Schwarzenegger vehicle was underperforming. Jingle All the Way in fourth. Space Jam was about struggling to make its money back. And the Oscar films were coming through. Romeo and Juliet from Baz Luhrmann. That was doing good numbers. The English Patient was a month in and gradually building up. Shine was about as well. And the problem for Daylight is, well, the week after came Jerry Maguire and Mars Attacks and The Preacher's Wife. And Mars Attacks, another in this winter of films that slightly underperformed, along with Jingle All the Way. Beavis and Butthead Do America, that came out the week after. And by this stage, well, Daylight was down to 10th place inside 3 weeks, and it was struggling. Scream came out, and that was the surprise hit of the winter 96 season. And then you've got John Travolta headlining the big Christmas release, John Travolta headlining Michael, but even that underperformed as well. And it was the unlikely films that were breaking through. The Jerry Maguires, Scream, Beavis and Butthead did well as well. Leaving Daylight really struggling a little bit for domestic air. It grossed $33 million in the US in the end. However, perhaps vindicating to a degree Universal's confidence in Sylvester Stallone, it did deliver outside of America. This was not a flop. $126 million. Stallone's name travelled around the world for a total gross of $159 million. And, I mean, disappointing, certainly, but a disaster. Well, the film was about a disaster, but the actual movie itself, no, not really. It just about paid its bills and it just about scraped through for Universal. For Stallone, though, it would be, it would be this turning point film, because after that, he went on to Copland, and Copland didn't do great box office, but he did get great reviews for that particular production. And then afterwards, well, he started to struggle again at the box office. That the films he was doing for Universal, they kind of disappeared, really. He did a remake of Get Carter. He did Avenging Angelo. He did Driven. And it wasn't really until The Expendables came along and he rebooted Rocky that he found yet another fresh wave in his career. Daylight isn't a terrible film. I would maintain that. It's not a film I've revisited in any great hurry, but it is a turning point one, that the traditional movie star vehicles that Hollywood had banked on, well, they were slowly beginning to decline. And Stallone, as much as his agent picked up the right time to send his invoices in, was also bearing the brunt of the declining fortunes of major international film stars. Still, he would rise again. Special effects would certainly rise as well, and we'll come to Copland in a future episode. Not that Copland's got special effects, of this podcast. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening to my waffle, and thank you for your time. If you're not completely bored of me, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. Heck, I'm really muffing this up, aren't I? You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories. I'm on Facebook, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. Our website is filmstories.co.uk. Our shop is store.filmstories.co.uk. Our Patreon is patreon.com/Simon Brew. And I think that'll do for now. I think I've talked way too much as usual. As always, the main thing is you all take care. You all look after yourselves. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories.